Act 2. The pearl consomme mutates. The copper pot hissed as Blanc poured the first of the hollowed pearls into its belly. Steam coiled upward, thick with the scent of brine and something sharper, metallic, like the first cut of a blade. He had expected the broth to darken, to deepen, but instead it brightened, shifting from a soft, milky glow to something harder, more insistent. The light pulsed, opalescent, casting shifting reflections across the curved walls of the chamber. His fingers tightened around the ladle. The pearls sank slowly, dissolving not with the gentle sigh of the first year's ingredients, but with a sound like cracking ice. He stirred. The broth resisted at first, thick and sluggish, then yielded with a sudden, violent swirl. The surface rippled, not with the gentle undulation of before, but with something almost alive. Blanc leaned closer, his breath fogging the air above the pot. The steam carried no warmth. It was cold, clammy, the kind of chill that settled into the bones and stayed. Then he saw it. A thin, pale ridge had formed along the inside of the copper, just above the broth's surface. He reached out, hesitated, then brushed his fingertips against it. The texture was wrong, too smooth, too precise, like the edge of a shell. He scraped at it with his nail. It did not flake. It did not crumble. It held fast, stubborn as bone. Just sediment, he told himself. A byproduct. Nothing more. But his pulse betrayed him, quick and uneven beneath his skin. He stirred again, harder this time, as if force alone could dispel the unease coiling in his gut. The broth churned, the opalescent light flickering in time with the rhythm of his arm. The coral, sediment. It's just sediment, spread, creeping upward in delicate branching tendrils. It was beautiful in its way, like frost on glass, like the veins of a leaf, like something that should not have been growing inside a pot meant for boiling. Blanc exhaled, slow and measured, and forced his hands to still. The broth settled. The light steadied. The coral formations gleamed, wet and alive, catching the dim glow of the fire that burned in the chamber's trapped air. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he was imagining things. He told himself he would check again in the morning. But when he finally stepped back, the pot's reflection in the polished stone floor showed not his face, but the slow, relentless spread of something that was no longer content to be contained. The pearl consomme dreams in cobalt. The broth remembered her first. It rose in slow, viscous curls, thickening the air above the cauldron until the surface trembled, not with heat, but with recognition. Celeste's face formed in the steam, her features blurred at the edges, as if dissolving back into memory before they could fully resolve. The scent of salt and crushed pearl filled the chamber, but beneath it, something sharper. The metallic bite of pigment, the acrid tang of linseed oil, her alchemy, the work he had abandoned. You left me behind. The voice came not from the broth, but from the walls themselves, seeping through the living stone like water through coral. It carried the weight of years she had lived without him, years she had spent building something that could not be distilled or extracted or consumed. The chamber absorbed her words, holding them in its porous depths, and for a moment the fire dimmed as if in deference. She watched from the dream's edge, unseen. This was not her memory. It was his. But she had learned to inhabit the spaces between his guilt and his ambition, to speak from the silence he had left behind. Though you left me behind, the aroma of your sorcery remains etched in my mind. Blanc's hands twitched in his sleep. The broth darkened at the edges, streaks of cobalt bleeding into the pearlescent sheen like veins of lapis and marble. The color was hers. The defiance was hers. The work was hers alone. The dream shifted. She stood in her studio in Lyon, sunlight slanting through the high windows, dust motes whirling in the golden air. Her back was to him, always to him now, a deliberate refusal. The easel before her held a canvas half finished, the pigments still wet, their colors too vivid to be real. Cobalt, ultramarine, a blue so deep it seemed to drink the light. Some things cannot be extracted, Blanc. Her voice was sharp, the way it had been when she'd caught him trying to distill her favorite pigment into its base components, back when they had still believed in the purity of reduction, back when he had still thought everything could be broken down into essence. Some things must be created. She turned then, just enough for him to see the brush in her hand, the way her fingers moved with certainty, pressing the pigment into the canvas in thick, deliberate strokes. The color resisted. It did not dissolve. It did not yield. It remained itself, whole, unbroken, defiant. His breath hitched in the dream, a sound like a drowning man surfacing. The broth in the cauldron darkened further, the cobalt spreading until the entire surface was a mirror of her work, a reflection of what he could never possess. She smiled. It was not a kind expression. Every person in the hall waited in tense quiet. Blanc's body jerked against the stone slab where he slept, his limbs stiffening as if already calcifying. The fire in the hearth flared, casting jagged shadows across the walls, and for a moment, the dream's edges frayed. The studio in Lion flickered like a candle flame, replaced by the cold, unyielding stone of the sealed chamber. The broth stilled. The scent of pigment faded, replaced by the sterile tang of salt and pearl. She lingered in the space between waking and sleep, watching as his eyes fluttered open. His hands were trembling, not from guilt, not from sorrow, from the realization that she had continued without him, that she had built something he could not break, that she had refused to be hollowed. The chamber absorbed his silence, the stone drinking in the weight of his failure. The fire dimmed, its light retreating into the embers, and the broth in the cauldron cooled, its surface hardening into a brittle crust. The cobalt remained, a stain upon the pearl. She had left her mark, and he would spend the rest of his time beneath the waves trying to erase it. The copper pot hissed where the flame licked its belly, sending up curls of steam that coiled around Blanc's wrists like manacles. He did not look up when the chamber door groaned open. He knew the weight of her presence before she spoke, the way the water in the basin trembled at her approach, the way the air thickened with the scent of brine and something darker, something like crushed pearl and old rage. Iris stepped between him and the fire, her tail brushing the stone floor with a sound like silk dragged over glass. The light caught the edges of her scales, turning them the color of storm clouds. And for a moment he let himself imagine she was only here to watch the broth reduce, to marvel at the way the surface shimmered like liquid opal. But then she reached into the pouch at her hip and withdrew a single pearl, pale as a drowned moon, and his fingers stilled around the stirring rod. "This was in the last batch," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a blade unsheathed. The pearl rolled across her palm, leaving a faint trail of luminescence in its wake. "I counted them after you left. 3 missing." Blanc set the rod down with deliberate care. The broth scent, salt and memory, and something faintly metallic, clung to the back of his throat. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it even. But the sight of that pearl in her hand, the way it caught the firelight and held it like a secret, made his pulse stutter in his veins. "You took them without asking," she continued, and now her tail lashed once, sharp against the stone. The sound echoed in the chamber, bouncing off the walls lined with stolen pearls, with sketches of Celeste's face that had begun to blur at the edges. "You used me. Again." The word again settled between them, heavy as a dropped anchor. Blanc exhaled through his nose, slow, measured. He had rehearsed this, had told himself that when the moment came, he would meet her anger with reason, with the cold logic of necessity. But the way she looked at him now, like he was something she had scraped from the bottom of her boot, made the words stick in his throat. "I needed them," he said at last. His voice sounded rough, unused. He cleared his throat. "The consommé requires essence. Yours is potent." Iris's laugh was a brittle thing, sharp enough to cut. "Potent," she snapped, the pearl between her fingers. It shattered like glass, sending up a puff of iridescent dust that caught in the steam and swirled toward the ceiling. "That's what you call it when you take what isn't yours? When you hollow out your lover and call it science?" The word lover struck him like a physical blow. He had never named it, not aloud, not even in the quiet of his own thoughts. But she had. And now it hung between them, a confession and an accusation all at once. Blanc turned back to the pot, stirring with more force than necessary. The broth sloshed against the sides, sending up a fresh wave of steam. "You think I enjoy this?" he asked, and the bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "You think I wake each morning and relish the thought of carving pieces from the people I—" He cut himself off, swallowed. "The work requires sacrifice." You know this. I know you told me the consommé was for Thessaly's court, Iris said. Her voice was closer now. He didn't turn, but he could feel the heat of her body at his back, the way the water in the chamber seemed to hum in response to her presence. I know you swore it would spare the others, but you never said it would take from me. Blanc tightened his grip on the stirring rod. The copper was warm beneath his fingers, almost alive. Would you have given them if I had asked? Silence. The kind that pressed against his eardrums, that made the fire's crackle sound like distant thunder. He turned then, just enough to see her from the corner of his eye. She stood with her arms crossed, her scales catching the light in a way that made her look like she was carved from something precious, something rare. Her gaze was fixed on the pot, on the broth that simmered and shifted, that held within it the stolen essence of a dozen merfolk, and now 3 pearls that had once been hers. No, she said at last. I wouldn't have. Blanc nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected, as if it didn't twist something inside him, something that had once been soft and was now calloused and cold. Then you understand why I didn't ask. Iris's tail lashed again, harder this time. The sound was like a whip crack. I understand that you've spent months lying to me, that you've been using me the same way you use everyone else, that you don't see me as a person, but as a resource. The word resource landed like a stone in his gut. Blanc turned fully to face her, his hands curling into fists at his sides. That's not... Don't. Her voice was a blade. Don't tell me it's not true. Don't tell me you see me as anything more than another ingredient in your damned potion. Blanc opened his mouth, closed it. The fire popped behind him, sending up a shower of sparks that died before they hit the floor. He could lie, could tell her that she was different, that she had always been different, but the words tasted like ash on his tongue. I see you, he said instead, and his voice was low, rough. I see the way your scales catch the light when you're angry. I see the way you hold your breath when you're thinking. I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. He took a step toward her, close enough that he could see the way her pupils dilated, the way her breath hitched just slightly. But yes, I also see the way your essence strengthens the consommé. I see the way your memories could make it perfect, and I won't apologize for that. Iris stared at him, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow movements. The air between them was thick with the scent of the broth, with the weight of everything unsaid. For a moment, he thought she might strike him, might turn and leave, might report him to Thessaly and watch as the queen's guards dragged him from the chamber in chains. But then she exhaled, slow and controlled, and the tension in her shoulders eased, just a fraction. You're right, she said, and her voice was quiet now, almost resigned. You won't apologize, because you don't think you've done anything wrong. Blanc said nothing. He didn't need to. Iris turned away, her tail flicking against the stone as she moved toward the shelves that lined the chamber's far wall. Jars of powdered pearl and crushed coral glinted in the firelight, their contents shifting like sand in an hourglass. She reached for one, her fingers brushing the glass, and Blanc felt something tighten in his chest. What are you doing? He asked, though he already knew. Iris didn't look at him. Fixing your mistake. She unscrewed the jar's lid and dipped her fingers inside, pulling out a pinch of something pale and inert. Blanc recognized it at once. Ground oyster shell, useless for the consommé, but similar enough in texture to pass for pearl dust at a glance. She turned back to the pot, her movements deliberate, unhurried, and dropped the powder into the broth. The surface hissed. A thin film of scum formed, spreading like a stain. Blanc's breath caught. Stop. Iris didn't even glance at him. No. She reached for another jar, this one filled with something that looked like salt, but wasn't. Something that would turn the broth cloudy and weak. Blanc lunged forward, his hand closing around her wrist before she could drop it in. Her skin was cool beneath his fingers, her pulse a steady thrum against his palm. You don't know what you're doing, he said, and his voice was low, dangerous. Iris finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark, endless, the color of the deep. I know exactly what I'm doing. For a moment, they stood there, locked in place, her wrist still caught in his grip. The fire crackled between them, the broth simmered, and the weight of what she was doing, what she was choosing, settled over Blanc like a shroud. She wasn't leaving, wasn't reporting him, wasn't even fighting him, not really. She was staying. And she was going to ruin everything, Blanc released her wrist, stepped back. The space between them felt like a chasm, like the distance between the surface and the deepest trench, a place where light never reached and pressure crushed bone to dust. I won't let you, he said. Iris's lips curled, just slightly. You won't have a choice. She turned back to the pot, her fingers already reaching for another jar. Blanc watched her, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He could stop her, could take the jars from her, could lock her out of the chamber, could go to Thessaly himself and tell her that Iris was sabotaging the work. But he didn't. Because the truth was, he did have a choice, and he had already made it. The water pressed against Iris's gills like a held breath, thick with the weight of something unsaid. She drifted through the corridor of living stone, her tail flicking once, twice, each movement slower than the last, as if the current itself had grown sluggish. The bioluminescent anemones lining the walls pulsed unevenly, their light stuttering like a dying heartbeat. She reached out to touch one, and the glow dimmed beneath her fingers, retreating into the flesh of the creature as if afraid. Her reflection rippled across the obsidian surface of a still pool embedded in the wall. She paused, tilting her head. The mermaid staring back at her was wrong. The scales along her collarbones had dulled, their iridescence leached away. Not all at once, no, this was worse. A slow erosion, like salt eating at the edges of something once bright. She traced a finger along her throat, and the skin there felt thinner, almost translucent. When she pressed, the flesh gave beneath her touch, yielding too easily, as if the muscle beneath had already begun to dissolve. A sound escaped her, a whisper, not a song. Her voice had always been clear, rich as the deep currents, but now it frayed at the edges, unraveling before it reached the water. She turned away from the pool, but the image clung to her. The way her tail had flickered, sluggish. The way the anemone's light had dimmed at her touch. No. She swam faster, propelling herself through the corridor, past the great hall where the court drifted, like half-remembered dreams. Their scales, too, had lost their luster. Their voices, when they spoke, were faint, as if carried from a great distance. Thessaly's throne loomed at the center of the chamber, its coral branches twisting into shapes that almost resembled faces. Faces that watched, silent and knowing. Iris did not linger. She had seen enough. Her workshop was a cavern of stolen light, the walls lined with vials of captured memory, their contents swirling in hues she had once thought beautiful. Now, they only made her stomach clench. She reached for the mortar where she had ground her own pearls into powder, intending to sabotage Blanc's work. The bowl was empty. Not just empty, clean, as if it had never held anything at all. Her fingers curled into fists. She found him in the chamber where the consommé simmered, its surface shimmering with an unnatural sheen. Blanc stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath the thin fabric of his human shirt. The broth in the cauldron was no longer clear. It had darkened, thickened, turning the color of old bruises. You took them, she said. He did not turn. Took what? The pearls, the ones I ground. A pause. Then, quietly, I needed them. The words settled over her like a weight. She had known, of course, or she had suspected, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way her suspicions never had. You've been dosing me, she said. This time, he turned. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed. But there was no guilt in his expression, only calculation. Yes. The admission should have hurt. It should have burned. Instead, it settled into her bones like a cold certainty. She swam closer, her tail brushing against the edge of the cauldron. The heat of the broth radiated through the water, seeping into her skin. How long? Since the beginning. The beginning. When she had first brought him a pearl, still warm from her palm. When she had watched him tuck it into his journal, his fingers lingering on hers. When she had believed, foolishly, desperately, that she was helping him. She reached out, letting her fingers hover just above the surface of the consommé. The broth trembled, responding to her presence. You used me against myself. No, he said, and there was something almost like regret in his voice. I used what you gave me. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You didn't ask. Would you have said yes? The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. She thought of the way her scales had dulled, the way her voice had faded, the way her own reflection had stared back at her, hollow and unfamiliar. No, she said at last. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had always known. Then I didn't ask. She should have been angry. She should have struck him, or screamed, or done something, anything, to prove she was still herself. But the hollowness inside her had already begun to spread, and she understood, with a terrible clarity, that her anger would not change what had already been done. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her belt and pulled out the vial she had stolen from him days ago. The glass was warm, as if it had been waiting for her. Her name was etched into the surface in his handwriting. She uncorked it. The scent of the consommé rose to meet her, briny, thick, with the faintest undertone of something sweet. Memory. Her memory. Blanc's eyes widened. Iris? She drank. The broth burned as it slid down her throat, not with heat, but with the cold precision of a blade. It settled into her stomach, then spread outward, seeping into her veins, her bones, her scales. Her reflection in the cauldron's surface fractured, splintering into a dozen different versions of herself, some angry, some afraid, some already gone. She met Blanc's gaze. His face was pale, his hands trembling. Now we're the same, she said. And for the first time, she understood what that truly meant. The vial rolled across the stone slab, cobalt light catching in its curves. Celeste's fingers, still surface warm, still capable of gripping a brush, had signed the label in ink that refused to bleed, even underwater. Celeste Veyrat, Lion, 1891. The date was a lie, of course. She hadn't been in Lion for years, but the signature was real, the pigment inside was real, and the fact that it had reached Thessaly's private chambers at all was a miracle of defiance. From the surface, Celeste watched. She had sent the vial as tribute, yes, but not to the Mer Queen, to Iris, to the one who had once been whole, before Blanc's alchemy began its slow unraveling. Celeste had spent months perfecting the blue, testing it against every solvent, every pressure, every attempt at extraction. It held. It resisted. And now, in the depths where memory was currency and flesh was negotiable, that resistance was a weapon. Thessaly's private chambers were a cavern of calcified silence. The walls, slick with centuries of condensation, wept slow tears that never quite reached the floor. Bioluminescent anemones pulsed weakly in the corners, their light dimmed by the weight of secrets pressed into the stone. Celeste had never been inside, but she knew the shape of the space, knew the way Thessaly would be reclining on her coral throne, knew the way Iris would be standing just beyond arm's reach, her scales dulling with each passing day. The Mer Queen lifted the vial, turning it so the cobalt caught the dim light. A human artist sent this as tribute, she said, voice smooth as a blade sliding between ribs. She claims it cannot be extracted. Do you believe her? Celeste held her breath. Not that it mattered. She was watching from the surface, from the safety of her studio, where the air still tasted of salt and turpentine. But the tension reached her anyway, a phantom ache in her chest. Iris reached for the vial. Her fingers, long, elegant, once capable of weaving pearls into intricate patterns, closed around the glass. Celeste had seen those hands at work before, seen them shape and create. Now they trembled, not from fear, from recognition. The signature, the weight of the pigment, the way the cobalt refused to settle, even in the stillness of the chamber. Iris knew. She knew. Thessaly watched, her golden eyes sharp as shattered glass. Well? Iris didn't answer. Instead, she turned the vial in her palm, studying the way the light fractured through the cobalt. Then, slowly, deliberately, she slipped it into the pouch at her hip. Celeste exhaled. The Mer Queen's lips curled, just slightly. Keep it then. See if it lasts. Iris didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't give Thessaly the satisfaction of a response. She simply turned and left, her tail flicking once against the stone before she disappeared into the dim corridor beyond. Celeste waited. Later, in the privacy of her own chambers, Iris uncorked the vial. The pigment was thicker than she remembered, richer. Celeste had layered it with something, resin maybe, or a binding agent that refused to dissolve. It clung to the glass like a second skin. Iris dipped her fingers into the cobalt. The first touch was electric, not in the way of shock, but in the way of recognition. The pigment knew her, or she knew it. Either way, the moment her fingertips brushed the surface, something in her chest loosened. She didn't hesitate. With slow, deliberate strokes, she painted a single line down the length of her tail. The cobalt clung to her scales, refusing to be absorbed, refusing to fade. It held, a streak of defiance, vivid against the dulling silver of her flesh. Celeste watched from the surface, her own fingers twitching as if she could feel the pigment beneath them. Iris studied her reflection in the chamber's glass. The cobalt streak was stark, unmistakable. A mark, a claim, a prayer. Celeste knew what it meant, knew that Iris wasn't just defying Blanc's work. She was remembering what it was to create, to resist, to be. And for the first time in years, Celeste let herself hope. The pigment would not last. Thessaly would see it. Blanc would see it. The court would see it. But for now, in the dim light of Iris's chambers, the cobalt burned bright. And Celeste, watching from the surface, smiled. The vial was warm against her palm, or perhaps her palm was cold. Thessaly did not look down to check. She knew the weight of it, the smooth curve of the glass, the way the broth inside caught the chamber's dim bioluminescence and turned it into something opalescent, something alive. The coral-encrusted throne dug into her spine, the calcified knobs of ancient challengers pressing into her flesh like the memory of teeth. She had built this seat from the bones of those who thought they could take what was hers. Now it held her as she held the vial, and neither of them would let go. She lifted it to her lips. The first taste was always salt, brine, and the faint metallic tang of something older, something that had lived and died in the dark. Then came the heat, not of fire, but of a body pressed too close, the kind of warmth that promised both comfort and consumption. The broth slid down her throat, thick as honey, but with the weight of mercury. And for a moment there was only the sensation of swallowing, of something foreign taking up residence in her chest. Then the memories came. Not hers. Not at first. A face rose from the broth's depths, her mate's, but not as she remembered him. This was his face in the moment before the blade found his throat, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with something worse, the terrible understanding that she had given the order. She saw his lips form her name, not as a plea, but as a question. And the question was not why, but how long have you known you would do this? The memory was not hers, but it lived in her now, transmitted through the broth like a disease, and she felt the weight of his final breath, as if it were her own lungs collapsing. The container escaped her hold. It did not shatter. The chamber's floor was too soft, the stone worn smooth by centuries of her pacing, her raging, her silent calculations. The broth pooled at her feet, a small, glowing puddle that reflected nothing. She exhaled, but the breath did not leave her. It stayed, trapped in her chest like a held scream. Another memory surfaced, this one not of death, but of extraction. A mermaid, young, her scales still iridescent with the sheen of youth, strapped to the table in the lower chambers. Thessaly had not been present for this one, but the broth showed her anyway. She saw her own hands, or were they someone else's, pressing the pearl against the mermaid's sternum, felt the resistance of flesh giving way, the wet sound of something tearing. The mermaid's mouth opened in a silent scream, and Thessaly tasted the sound, copper and salt, and the faint, sickly sweetness of something dying from the inside out. The memory was not hers, but it was now. The broth did not distinguish. She pressed her palms against her eyes until the darkness behind her lids bloomed with after-image. Her mate's face, the mermaid's scream, the way the pearl had glowed in the moment before it was taken. When she lowered her hands, her vision swam, and for a moment she thought she saw the chamber's walls breathing, the coral on her throne pulsing like a slow, steady heartbeat. The broth was working. She had known it would. She had wanted it to. The first time she had tasted the consommé, it had been a revelation, a way to see the desires of others, to understand what they wanted so she could take it from them before they even knew they wanted it. The second time, it had shown her the cost of that understanding, the way desire curdled into resentment, the way resentment festered into rebellion. The third time, it had shown her the faces of those she had crushed, the ones who had looked at her with something like hope before she hollowed them out. This time, it was different. This time, it was not showing her anything new. This time, It was erasing what she already knew. The realization came not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, like the slow unraveling of a knot she had not known was there. Her fingers, no, not her fingers, her scales, felt loose, as if they were no longer anchored to the muscle beneath. She looked down and saw that her hands were translucent, the veins beneath her skin visible as faint blue threads, pulsing in time with the chamber's dim light. She flexed her fingers, and the movement was sluggish, as if she were moving through water thicker than the sea. She stood. The throne did not release her easily. The coral clung to her, the calcified remains of her enemies refusing to let her go. She had to peel herself away, her skin sticking to the stone like wet parchment. When she finally broke free, the sound was wet, tearing, and for a moment she thought she saw something glisten on the throne's surface, something that might have been blood, or might have been the last of her own moisture, leaching out of her. She took a step. Her bones felt hollow, not in the way of a body that had been starved, but in the way of a shell that had been scraped clean. She pressed a hand to her sternum and felt the give of something that should not have given. The broth was in her now, not just in her stomach, but in her bones, in the spaces between her cells, in the marrow that had once been dense with the weight of her rule. She took another step. The chamber tilted. The walls, which had always been steady, seemed to sway, and for a moment she thought she saw the faces of the dead pressed into the stone. Her mate, the mermaid, the hundreds of others whose names she had long since forgotten. They were not screaming. They were not even looking at her. They were simply there, their hollowed-out eyes reflecting the same emptiness she now felt in her own chest. She reached for the vial again. It was still warm, still full. She drank. The second taste was different. The salt was still there, the heat, the weight, but beneath it was something else. Something like the absence of sound, like the moment after a scream when the air is still vibrating but the throat is already raw. The memories came faster this time, overlapping, a cacophony of faces and voices and moments that were not hers but now lived in her like parasites. She saw Blanc's hands trembling as he stirred the broth, saw Iris's eyes watching her with something like pity, saw the cord around her growing translucent, their desires leaching out of them like dye in water. And then, beneath it all, she saw herself. Not as she was now, but as she had been. Younger, harder, her scales still deep water blue, her eyes sharp with the certainty of her own power. She saw herself ordering the death of her mate, saw herself extracting pearls from living flesh, saw herself drinking the consomme for the first time and feeling the rush of understanding, the terrible clarity of knowing what she wanted and how to take it. She saw herself becoming the thing she now was. The small bottle tumbled out of her grasp once more. This time, it did not fall. It hovered in the air between her hands, suspended by some force she could not name. The broth inside swirled, catching the light, and for a moment she thought she saw Celeste's face in the liquid. Celeste, who had been Blanc's before she had been Thessaly's. Celeste, whose memory Blanc had poured into the broth like poison. The vial shattered. The sound was not loud, but it echoed in the hollow space of her chest, in the places where her bones had already begun to turn to coral. The broth splashed across the floor, and where it touched the stone, the coral on her throne moved, the calcified remains of her enemies shifting, rearranging themselves into something new, something that looked like her. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply stood there, her translucent hands pressed to her translucent chest, and felt the hollowness take root. It was not a sudden thing. It was not a revelation. It was the cumulative effect of every tasting, every extraction, every moment of power that had required the hollowing of someone else. The consummate did not forgive. It did not judge. It simply accelerated, taking the consequences of her tyranny and compressing them into a single, inescapable truth. She had already been hollowed. She had been hollowed the first time she drank the broth. She had been hollowed the first time she ordered a death. She had been hollowed the first time she looked at someone and saw not a person, but a resource. The throne behind her pulsed, the coral shifting, growing, spreading across the floor like a living thing. She turned slowly, her movements sluggish, and saw that the calcified remains of her enemies were not just rearranging themselves. They were reaching for her. She did not run. She did not fight. She simply stood there, her breath shallow, her bones brittle, and let the hollowness take her. The last thing she saw before the coral swallowed her was her own reflection in the broth-stained floor. It was not a face. It was a mask. The chamber remembered blood. Thessaly's claws scraped the armrest of her coral throne as she shifted, the sound too loud in the hollow quiet. The walls of her private sanctum, once slick with the bioluminescence of power, now dull as old bone, absorbed the noise without echo. She had not summoned Iris for ceremony, not this time. The pearlescent doors parted before the younger Mer could knock, and there she stood, her scales still holding the faintest luster of defiance, though Thessaly had long since learned to recognize the hollowness beneath. Iris entered without bowing. Good. Let her think herself above such gestures. Let her believe, for now, that the balance had not yet tipped. Thessaly did not rise. Her body ached with the weight of centuries, though she had not aged in the way of mortals. No, this was something worse. A brittleness, a slow crystallization of the self. She felt it in the way her fingers trembled as she lifted the vial from the tray beside her. The glass was warm, too warm, as if the consomme inside still pulsed with the memories it had stolen. Have you noticed, Thessaly said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her grip, how the court moves slower now? Iris's gaze flicked to the vial, then back to Thessaly's face. She did not answer. There was no obligation for her to do so. The question was not a question. Thessaly uncorked the vial. The scent of the broth rose between them. Salt and something older, something that had festered in the dark. She drank. The first swallow burned. The second unraveled her. Memory struck like a blade between the ribs. His throat, pale against the black water. The way his blood had bloomed, slow and deliberate, as if time itself had paused to watch. She saw her own claws in the vision, slick with crimson, and then, worse, she saw her face. Not as she was now, but as she had been then. Young, hungry, her eyes alight with the thrill of the kill, the thrill of the choice. She had not hesitated. The glass tube dropped from her palm. It struck the floor without shattering, rolling to a stop against the base of her throne. Iris did not move to retrieve it. She stood very still, her breath shallow, her pupils dilated in the dim light, watching, always watching. Thessaly's gills flared, struggling for air. The memory clung to her like kelp, dragging her deeper. His voice, whispering her name. The way his body had gone limp, not in surrender, but in betrayal. Because he had trusted her. She had told herself it was necessary, that the court needed strength, that she needed strength, that the ends justified the means. The consomme did not lie. Her claws dug into the arms of her throne, the coral biting back. An urge to shriek overwhelmed her. She wanted to tear the vision from her mind and hurl it into the abyss. But the broth had already done its work. The memory was hers now, inescapable, and worse, it was visible. Iris had seen it too. The flicker in her eyes, the way her fingers twitched at her sides. Thessaly knew the signs. The telepathic current had carried the vision beyond her, a ripple in the water, a secret no longer hers alone. Silence stretched between them, thick as the sediment at the ocean's floor. Thessaly's bioluminescence flickered. No, not flickered. Dimmed. As if the light itself had grown weary of her. Iris spoke at last, her voice low. You're afraid. Thessaly's jaw tightened. She did not deny it. She could not. The fear was a living thing inside her, coiling around her ribs, squeezing until her breath came in shallow gasps. Not fear of Iris. Not fear of the court. Fear of the truth the consomme had forced her to swallow, that she had built her reign on a foundation of corpses, and now the foundation was crumbling. She had thought herself untouchable. She had thought the power would sustain her forever. She had been wrong. Stillness enveloped the courtroom like a shroud. The walls, the throne, the spilled vial at her feet, all of it bore witness to her unraveling. And Iris? Iris remained motionless, her face betraying nothing. No, not unreadable. Knowing. Thessaly's claws released the throne. She let her hands fall to her lap, her fingers curling into fists. The memory of her mate's blood still clung to her, a stain no amount of time could wash clean. She had summoned Iris to gauge the depth of the court's lethargy. Instead, she had revealed the depth of her own. The chamber smelled of salt and slow decay. Iris's tail flicked against the stone floor, the sound swallowed by the thick, still air. She had come for answers. Why Blanc's hands shook when he stirred the consomme. why his eyes lingered on the pearls she brought him, why the broth now carried the faintest shimmer of cobalt at its edges. But the answers, it seemed, had been waiting for her elsewhere. Her fingers slid beneath Blanc's pillow, the fabric slick with the damp of the chamber. Something cold met her touch. Not stone, not shell, glass. She pulled it free. A vial, no larger than her smallest finger joint, rested in her palm. Her name curled across the surface in Blanc's precise script, Iris, the ink dark against the pale glass. The vial was warm, not from the chamber's stagnant heat, not from the distant pulse of the fire that kept the consommé simmering, but from something else, from waiting, from being held, just for her. Her grip tightened. The liquid inside caught the dim light filtering through the water above, shifting between opal and cobalt. She knew this color, had seen it in the broth Blanc stirred, in the hollowed eyes of the merfolk who brought their pearls to him, in the way her own reflection had begun to lose its edges. The consomme, the final distillation, the one he had been perfecting in secret. Her breath came shallow, the air thick with the scent of brine and something sharper, almond perhaps, or the metallic tang of old blood. The vial's warmth seeped into her skin, as if it recognized her, as if it had been made for her. She turned it in her fingers, watching the liquid slosh. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Blanc's voice, low and measured, speaking of extraction. The first time is always the hardest. After that, it becomes a kind of hunger. She had thought he meant the pearls, but he hadn't. He had meant this. The vial was a confession, a claim, a weapon, and it was warm because it had been waiting for her to find it. Iris's tail coiled around her, the scales pressing into her own flesh. The chamber seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in, the fire's glow casting long, wavering shadows. She could hear the distant drip of water, the crackle of the flames, the slow, steady beat of her own pulse in her throat. But beneath it all, there was something else, a whisper, almost too faint to hear, a voice she almost recognized. You abandoned me, yet the fragrance of your magic lingers in my memory. Celeste. Iris's fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the vial in her hand. It was heavier than it should have been, heavier than memory, heavier than choice. She lifted the small bottle toward her mouth. The glass was warm against her skin. The liquid inside shimmered, cobalt and opal, and something darker, something that pulled at her, that promised to show her everything she had forgotten, to show her everything she had never known. Her name was etched on the glass, and the vial was waiting. The vial was warm in her palm, its glass smooth as a scale pulled fresh from the flank of a fish. Iris turned it over, watching the liquid inside catch the firelight, opalescent, shifting like the belly of a dying eel. Her name curled across the surface in Blanc's hand, the ink still damp. She did not need to read it to know what it said. She uncorked it with her teeth. The scent rose first, sharp and mineral, like crushed pearl mixed with the salt of old tears. It carried something else too, something that coiled in the back of her throat before she even drank. The memory of Blanc's hands, steady as he poured. The memory of Thessaly's voice, cool as she watched. The memory of her own reflection, already thinning at the edges. Iris tipped the vial back. The broth burned like swallowed pearls, each one a shard of glass working its way down her throat. She did not flinch. She had known it would hurt. She had known, and she drank anyway. The first fracture appeared in the glass before her. It spiderwebbed from the center, a crack so fine it might have been there all along, waiting. Her reflection split. One iris, two, then three, each version of her face slightly wrong, the angles just a little off, as if the glass were peeling her apart. She watched, fascinated, as the cracks spread. The broth was working faster than she'd expected, or perhaps she had simply been hollow for longer than she'd realized. She set the vial down with care, as if it were something precious. The glass chimed against the stone, a sound too bright for this place. The chamber seemed to lean in, the walls pressing closer, the firelight dimming at the edges of her vision. She could feel the consommé spreading through her, not like poison, but like ink and water, seeping into every hollow place she had tried to fill. Her fingers brushed the surface of the workbench. The wood was rough beneath her touch, splintered in places, stained with things she did not want to name. Blanc's tools lay scattered across it. tongs, a mortar and pestle, a knife with a blade so thin it might have been made of fish bone. She picked up the knife. The weight of it was familiar. She had used it before, to cut pearls from living flesh, to peel back the layers of memory like skin from fruit. She pressed the tip to her wrist. The pain was sharp, immediate. Blood welled, dark and thick, and for a moment, she thought she might vomit. But then the consommé reached the wound, and the pain dulled, smoothing into something distant, something that did not belong to her anymore. The blood slowed. The cut sealed itself, not with flesh, but with something else, something that gleamed in the firelight, iridescent and hard. She dropped the knife. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the chamber like a bell. She left it lying there. The choice lay entirely within her discretion. The work was already done. Her reflection fractured again. This time, the cracks spread outward, branching like coral, like veins, like the roots of some deep-sea thing that had been growing inside her all along. She watched as the pieces of her face shifted, rearranging themselves into something new, something hollow, something that could hold more than she had ever been able to hold before. She had thought she would feel loss. She had thought she would feel grief. But there was nothing. Only the slow, steady spread of the consommé, filling her up, smoothing out the rough edges, turning her into something sleek and empty and perfect. She turned away from the glass. The chamber stretched before her, the walls lined with Blanc's sketches, his notes, his careful, precise handwriting. She walked toward them, her steps light, her body moving without effort, as if she were no longer quite there, as if she were already halfway to something else. She stopped before the largest sketch, a face, half finished, the lines smudged where Blanc's fingers had traced them over and over. Celeste. The name came to her unbidden, sharp and clear, like a shard of glass pressed to her tongue. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the paper. She could almost feel the memory of Blanc's touch, the way his hands had trembled as he drew, the way his breath had hitched when he spoke her name. She lowered her hand. The consommé pulsed through her, warm and heavy, like a second heartbeat. It was not just her own essence she had swallowed. It was Blanc's. It was Thessaly's. It was the memory of every mermaid who had come before her, every hollowed-out shell that had fed the broth. She could feel them all, pressing against the inside of her skin, whispering in voices that were not quite voices, telling her things she had always known but had never let herself hear. She was not drinking to forget. She was drinking to remember. She was drinking to become what they had already made her. She turned back to the glass. Her reflection was whole again, but wrong. The angles were sharper, the edges harder, the eyes too bright, too empty. She smiled. The expression did not reach her eyes. She was ready. Absolute quiet filled the chamber entirely. She stepped forward, her body moving without her, her feet carrying her toward the door, toward the dark, toward whatever came next. The consomme hummed in her veins, a low, steady thrum, like the sound of the ocean trapped inside a shell. She did not look back. The broth turned cobalt first at the edges. From my studio in Lyon, where the afternoon light slanted through the high windows and pooled across my work table, I felt it, the shift, the deep and sudden chill that was not cold but absence. My fingers stilled over the half-ground lapis lazuli, the pestle heavy in my palm. The pigment resisted, as it always did, stubborn and unyielding, refusing to be broken down. I had chosen it for that very reason. Some things, I had told Blanc once, could not be extracted. Some things held their shape. Below the surface, in the sealed alchemical chamber where the air itself was thick with stolen breath, the consommé darkened. I saw it in my mind's eye, the copper pot glowing faintly, the broth swirling as Blanc stirred, his hands moving with the precision of a man who had long since stopped questioning the cost of his craft. And then, there it was, the blue. Not the soft azure of the Mediterranean at dawn, not the muted teal of a kingfisher's wing, but something deeper, something that drank the light. Cobalt. My cobalt. I set the pestle down. The memory of my voice rose unbidden, a ghost between my teeth. Blue is the color of creation. I had said it to Blanc years ago in another life, when we still believed in the purity of art, when we still believed in each other. I had meant it as a declaration, a defiance. Blue was the hue of the infinite, the shade of the sky before it learned to fear the fall. It was the color of resistance, of things that refused to be contained. And now he had taken it. Not the pigment itself, no, that remained stubborn in my mortar, unbroken, but the idea of it, the memory, the defiance. He had distilled it into his broth, and in doing so, he had proven me wrong. Everything could be extracted. Everything could be rendered down, refined, consumed. The realization settled in my chest like a stone. The chamber below was silent, but I heard it anyway. The scrape of Blanc's spoon against the copper, the slow bubble of the broth as it thickened. Iris was there, though I could not see her. I knew her by the weight of her presence, by the way the air in the chamber grew heavier when she watched him work. She had been hollowed out by him, piece by piece, her essence siphoned into his experiments, her memories traded for the promise of power. She allowed his departure to proceed unhindered. Not now, not ever. I wondered if she even could. The broth turned cobalt, then nearly black, as if absorbing all light. The copper pot would be glowing now, heated by the fire that burned beneath it. A fire that was not fire, but something older, something that fed on memory and despair. The air in the chamber would be thin, the oxygen nearly gone, the walls slick with condensation. Blanc's hands would be burned, his fingers scarred from years of tending the pot, of stirring the broth that had become his life's work, his masterpiece, his prison. And then, the whisper. She always said blue was the color of creation. I closed my eyes. He did not understand. He never had. He thought he was honoring me, preserving me, keeping my memory alive in his work. But he was wrong. The cobalt broth was not creation. It was erasure. It was the color of my resistance, twisted into something else, something that served his purpose, something that could be consumed. I opened my eyes. The lapis lazuli sat untouched in my mortar, its blue as deep and unyielding as ever. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the cool, rough surface. Some things, I thought, could not be extracted. But I was no longer sure. Below the surface, Iris moved. I felt her hesitation like a held breath. She did not speak. She did not stop him. But later, when the chamber was quiet and Blanc's back was turned, she reached for a vial. The cobalt broth gleamed within it, dark and thick, the color of a bruise. She tucked it into the folds of her dress, her fingers trembling, not with fear, but with something else, something closer to recognition. She did not know what she would do with it. Destroy it, perhaps, or drink it herself. The uncertainty was the point. I turned back to my work, the pestle heavy in my hand. The lapis lazuli resisted, as it always did. But I ground it anyway, pressing down with all my strength. The coloring remained intact. It would not yield. Not yet. But the broth below had already turned cobalt, and that was enough. The copper pot hissed where it rested against the brazier's coals, steam curling from its lip like a dying breath. Blanc's fingers hovered above the surface, not quite touching, as if the broth might burn him before he even dipped the ladle. The liquid inside had changed again. No longer the opalescent sheen of earlier batches. No longer the faint glow that had once made the chamber walls shimmer like mother of pearl. Now it was cobalt, deep and unnatural, the color of Celeste's last pigment, the one she'd sworn could never be extracted, the one he'd stolen from her memory anyway. He exhaled, slow, watching the steam ripple. The air in the sealed chamber was thick with the scent of brine, and something older, something like the moment before a storm breaks, the metallic tang of ozone, the weight of pressure building behind his ribs. The fire in the brazier guttered, starved for oxygen, its flames stretching long and blue as if trying to escape the dome. Blanc didn't stir the coals. He let the fire die a little more with each passing second. The vial lay on the workbench, its mouth open like a silent accusation. He'd prepared it earlier, etching his own initials into the glass with the tip of his knife. BM. The letters were uneven, the M too sharp, as if he'd pressed too hard, as if he'd wanted to cut himself. He reached for the ladle. The broth resisted at first, clinging to the copper like syrup. Then it gave way with a wet sound, slithering into the vial in a thick, slow pour. The cobalt darkened almost immediately, the liquid swallowing the light as it rose. By the time the vial was half full, the broth was black. Not the absence of color, but the presence of something deeper, something that drank in the firelight and held it. Blanc's reflection warped in the glass, stretched thin, then split into two faces. His own, hollow-eyed and gaunt, and then Celeste. Her face swam into focus, sharp and clear, as if she stood beside him. Her hair was loose, the way she'd worn it in the studio, strands of it caught in the paint on her fingers. Her lips parted, and her voice cut through the silence, low and certain. "You're not saving them. You're erasing us both." Blanc's breath stopped. The vial trembled in his grip, the glass warm against his skin. He didn't look away. He couldn't. Celeste's eyes held his, dark and knowing, and for the first time in years, he let himself see her. Not the memory he'd distilled, not the ghost he'd fed into the consommé, but her. The woman who had refused to be measured, who had laughed when he'd called her work unquantifiable, who had pressed her paint-stained thumb to his wrist and said, "Some things aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be felt." The vision held for 3 heartbeats. Then the broth rippled, and Celeste's face dissolved back into his own. Blanc set the vial down with deliberate care. His fingers left smudges on the glass, faint and greasy. He didn't wipe them away. The chamber was too quiet. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air tasted of ash and salt. He could hear the distant pulse of the ocean beyond the dome, the slow, rhythmic drag of waves against stone. It sounded like breathing, like something alive, waiting. He picked up the vial again. The broth inside was still now, black and still as oil. He rolled it between his palms, feeling the heat of it seep into his skin. The glass was smooth, almost slick, as if it had been worn down by years of handling, as if it had been waiting for this moment. His reflection stared back at him, fractured by the curve of the glass. He looked older than he remembered. The lines around his mouth were deeper, his cheeks hollow. His eyes were the worst, flat, empty, like the eyes of a man who had spent too long staring into the dark and seen nothing looking back. He thought of Iris, of the way her scales had lost their luster, the way her voice had grown faint, of the way she'd looked at him when she'd discovered the vial beneath his pillow, her name etched into the glass in his handwriting. He thought of Thessaly, reclining on her coral throne, swirling the consommé in her goblet like wine, her lips parted in pleasure as the broth revealed her victim's memories to her. He thought of the mermaids he'd hollowed, their pearls warm in his palm, their voices whispering in the steam. And he thought of Celeste. Not the Celeste in the vial. Not the Celeste he'd distilled into memory. The real Celeste. The one who had stood in her studio, her hands coated in cobalt pigment, and told him, "You can't control everything, Blanc. Some things are meant to be wild." He had tried to control her. He had tried to control all of it. The vial was heavy in his hand. He could feel the weight of it, the way it pulled at his wrist, as if it wanted to drag him down with it, as if it wanted to drown him. He reached for the cork. The chamber held its breath. The fire guttered. The broth in the vial did not stir. Blanc pressed the cork into place. The seal was perfect. The glass was smooth. The broth inside was black and still. He set the vial on the workbench and stepped back. His hands did not shake. They were steady. Too steady. As if they belonged to someone else. The fire in the brazier flared one last time, a final gasp of blue flame, before it died. The chamber plunged into darkness, the only light now the faint, sickly glow of the broth in the vial. Blanc's reflection stared back at him from the glass, warped and broken. His gaze remained fixed. His hand extended toward the glass container once more. This time, he did not hesitate. The copper pot hissed where it sat upon the brazier, steam curling in lazy spirals toward the vaulted ceiling. Blanc's fingers hovered above the broth's surface, not quite touching. The liquid should have shimmered, pearl white, opalescent, alive with the slow pulse of memory. Instead, it lay dull and flat, a stagnant pool of milk gone sour. His jaw set. The sabotage was crude but effective. A handful of salt, perhaps, or the crushed remains of a sea urchin's spine, enough to disrupt the balance, to mute the resonance of the memories he had so carefully distilled. He did not turn. He did not need to. The weight of Iris's gaze pressed against his back like the tide against a sinking ship. The workshop was otherwise empty. The walls, lined with stolen pearls and the occasional sketch of Celeste's face, her features now little more than smudges of charcoal. gleamed faintly in the blue light of the bioluminescent coral. The air smelled of brine and old paper, of the copper tang of the pot and the faint, acrid bite of the sabotage itself. Somewhere beneath it all lingered the scent of iris, salt water and crushed violets, the musk of her skin when she leaned too close. Blanc exhaled through his nose. The sound was quiet, deliberate, a dismissal. His hands moved without hesitation. He reached for the reserve vial tucked into the inner pocket of his coat, the one labeled Celeste in his own hand. The ink faded but still legible. The glass was warm, almost feverish, as if the memory it contained still burned with the heat of her life. He uncorked it with his teeth, the bitter taste of the stopper lingering on his tongue. The broth inside the vial was darker than the rest, a deep cobalt that verged on black, the color of Celeste's favorite pigment, the one she had sworn could not be extracted. You see? She had laughed, holding up the brush. The world cannot take what refuses to be given. Blanc poured. The memory hit the sabotaged consommé like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread across the surface, dark and hungry, swallowing the dullness. The broth brightened, not to its original pearlescence, but to something richer, something alive. The cobalt bled outward, threading through the liquid until the entire pot held the unnatural hue of Celeste's defiance. The scent of it filled the chamber. Crushed lapis, burnt sugar, the ghost of her laughter. Behind him, Iris made a sound. Not a word, not even a breath. A soft, wet click of her throat, as if she had swallowed something sharp. Blanc did not acknowledge it. He set the empty vial aside with care, aligning it precisely with the others on the workbench. His digits remained perfectly steady. His pulse did not quicken. There was no triumph in this, no satisfaction. Only the quiet, inevitable progression of his work. The consommé was whole again. The memories were secure. The hollowing would continue. He could feel Iris's presence like a bruise. She had not moved from the doorway, her tail coiled tight against the stone, her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. The scales along her collarbone had lost their luster weeks ago, dull as tarnished silver. She was fading. They all were. And yet, she had thought to stop him. Foolish, he thought. Beautiful, foolish thing. He turned at last, slow and deliberate, giving her the full weight of his gaze. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted just enough to show the tips of her teeth. She looked like a woman who had just realized she was drowning, and that no one was coming to save her. Blanc said nothing. He crossed to the far side of the chamber, where the fresh batch of pearls waited in a clay bowl. They were smaller than the others, these new ones, taken from merfolk who had already been hollowed, their memories drained, their bodies left empty husks. Thessaly had sent them with a note for the next phase. No signature, no explanation, just the cold efficiency of a queen who no longer needed to justify her cruelty. Blanc selected one, rolling it between his fingers. It was warm, alive. The memory inside it pulsed faintly, like a second heartbeat. Iris's voice cut through the silence, raw and brittle. You knew. He did not look up. I suspected. You suspected. A bitter laugh edged with something like a sob. You let me think I had a chance. Blanc set the pearl down. He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving streaks of cobalt across the fabric. You never had a chance. The words hung between them, heavy as the chamber's stone. Iris's breath came faster now, her chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow movements. The gills along her ribs fluttered, a telltale sign of her distress. Blanc watched them with clinical detachment. He had seen this before. The moment when resistance curdled into despair. It was always the same. The wide eyes, the trembling hands, the way the body betrayed the mind's last, desperate attempts at defiance. He had felt it himself, once. Iris's fingers twitched at her sides. Why not confront me? Why not punish me? Blanc turned back to the pot. The consommé simmered, its surface now a perfect, unbroken mirror of cobalt. He stirred it once, twice, the wooden spoon scraping softly against the copper. The sound was obscene in the silence. Because, he said at last, punishment implies you had a choice. The words settled over her like a shroud. Iris's shoulders hunched, her tail curling tighter around her legs. She looked smaller than she had a moment ago, diminished, broken. Blanc did not allow himself to feel satisfaction. Satisfaction was for men who still believed in victory. He had long since accepted that there was no winning this game, only playing it to its inevitable end. He reached for another pearl. This one was colder than the last, its surface rough with imperfections. A flawed vessel. He crushed it between his fingers without ceremony, letting the shards and the memory within fall into the pot. The broth darkened further, the cobalt deepening into something almost black, like the heart of a storm. Iris's voice was a whisper. What happens now? Blanc did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew. The consommé would be served. Thessaly would drink. The court would follow. The memories would be extracted, refined, consumed. The merfolk would hollow, one by one, until there was nothing left but empty shells and the quiet, endless hunger of the deep. And Iris? Iris would watch. She would watch, and she would understand, at last, that her resistance had never been anything more than another ingredient in the recipe, that her defiance had only made the broth stronger. Blanc stirred the pot one final time. The spoon left a trail of cobalt in its wake, like ink spilled across water. Behind him, Iris made no sound as she turned and left the chamber. The door closed with a soft, final click. Blanc kept his gaze downward. He had work to do.